Senator Kerry, thank you so much for joining us on Bloomberg Television.
Delighted to be with you, thank you.
It's 2 months to COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, yet here we are with the U.S. and China at odds, not talking to each other. We're talking about the two largest economies, two biggest polluters. How do you address one of the largest problems the world is facing today when the two are not talking?
Well, fortunately, Xi Jinping, the Chinese counterpart to my job, and I have known each other for 20 plus years, 25 years. And we had worked together in a number of meetings leading up to the suspension in which we laid out a mutual agenda that we both agreed on that we needed to work on. So I think we both know what we need to be doing. The challenge is that we're not able to engage at this moment in some of the cooperation that I think is so essential to help Sharm el-Sheikh be successful, but also to get the two largest emitters in the world, the two biggest economies in the world, talking to each other, working together, because that will help shape the response of other countries all around the planet. So I'm hopeful, I remain hopeful, that they did say they would suspend. That means that it could open at any given time. My hope is that President Xi will recognize the benefit of getting both of us moving in the same direction, leading to Sharm el-Sheikh. The world needs a positive message. The world needs to see these two powerful countries actually working together. And there is no bigger threat, frankly, on the planet right now than the climate crisis in the ways we are seeing every single day around the world. Glaciers disappearing, massive fires, mudslides, floods, gargantuan drought in so many different places. And this is only at 1.1 to 1.2 degrees of warming. If we go above 1.5 or head where we are now to 2.7 or 3.7, this planet is going to become unlivable for far, far too many people.
You talked about how you've been engaging with your Chinese counterpart. Are you engaging with him right now in any way?
No, we're not engaged right now because of the suspension. But I have personally sent a message to him that I know was received, simply to encourage the notion that we both continue working, that we do the things that we agreed on previously, and hopefully we'll be able to come back together in person.
How do you expect this agreement between the U.S. and China to perhaps impact the progress on methane, which was one of the biggest achievements at COP26?
Well, China agreed in Glasgow that they would, this year, announce a major, quote, ambitious national methane plan to reduce methane in China. And we were planning to be helpful to them in ways that we have learned might be able to be beneficial to China's ability to be able to do that. So our working group had made this perhaps one of the top targets of what we were going to work on. And my hope is that we can get back to that, because I think that the world would benefit if we're able to cooperate on methane. Methane is responsible for half the warming of the planet. It is also one of the easiest greenhouse gases to address. It's basically simple plumbing. There are leaks, there's leaks and flaring and venting. People see it in countries that are producing oil and gas. They burn off what is supposedly excess. In the case of Russia, is burning off what they used to give to Europe. But that is a huge contribution to very, very damaging gas, because methane is 20 to 80 times more damaging than CO2 in its early life, and we want to try to minimize that.
10 months on, how much progress has been made?
Well, individual countries are implementing methane programs, and it's relatively inexpensive in the sense that it's basic plumbing. You plug the leaks at the wellhead. You plug leaks in the pipes on transfer to shipping. You plug leaks during the shipping. You plug them at the storage and then on the final delivery. You also end the venting and the flaring, which is so much more obvious as a burn off of gas, which emits. That gas emits not just methane, but CO2 as well, and it contributes significantly to global warming challenge.
Given the disagreement,
to the crisis we face today.
Given the disagreement within the U.S. and China, are you perhaps concerned that some countries may use it as an excuse not to fulfill the climate commitments?
Yeah, there is that concern, sure. There are people looking for ways not to hold their feet to the fire. When big countries like ours don't fulfill their promises, and we are the biggest emitters, it has a profound impact on smaller countries that are struggling with less viable economies and have to commit resources to do these things. So yes, it has a negative impact.
One of the biggest issues right now is also the crisis, the energy crisis in Europe, with Russia, with Gazprom insisting on shutting off Nord Stream pipeline.
Yeah.
Perhaps there could be an energy catastrophe there. What's your own assessment of how bad it could potentially be?
Well, fuel, gas, oil, has been weaponized by President Putin. Now, in war, obviously people go to extremes because of the stakes. But it is absolutely vital that we not lose so many lessons that have been taught to us again and again since World War II and the post-World War structure came together, that we try to avoid collateral damage. We try to avoid dragging human beings into the dragnet of war where they are killed and put into horrendous situations and become the pawns in this bigger struggle. We have an obligation, all of us, to remember our values, to live by our values, to try to remind people of the imperative here of not taking a lot of innocent people and putting them in harm's way. And it is possible, with a really cold winter and with lack of supply, that things could be very, very difficult in certain places. I think that's one of the reasons why people hope that this will not be a long war or a forever war, or a war even that extends too much further into the future, because the cost to everybody could be magnified so many times over for the distraction, distraction's the wrong word, for just the imperative that comes with addressing the concerns of the war that takes you away from the simultaneous need to deal with a threat that is broader even in threatening nations and human beings, which is the climate crisis.
How long do you think this energy crisis in Europe will last? Because one Belgian minister estimated that Europe could see 10 difficult winters.
Look, I think it would be silly for me or anybody to predict where we're headed here, except to say that this is dangerous. And it requires responsible leadership to do everything in its power to bring people to the table and find peace, to find an alternative way to resolve these issues. Do I think there are things that could be talked about and resolved here? Yes, I do. And, but they also have to be ripe in the context of strategy and war and foreign policy. It's not yet ripe, but perhaps soon enough it will be. But I hope that as leaders focus on what the winter could bring, what is happening to human beings all around the world, the disruption of supply chains, the economic threat that comes with this, as well as just the horror of what is playing out every day in Ukraine on innocent people, hopefully wiser heads will prevail and come together.
What is the best stopgap measure, you think? Because we know that the U.S. has suggested exporting fossil fuels to fill that gap in Europe. Is that not a contradiction to what you're pursuing,
No.
which is clean energy?
It's not, as long as it is temporary, as long as it is accompanied by a huge uptick at the rate and the amount of renewable energy that is being deployed. You say, what is the shorthand, quick take out of this? It is, be as independent as you can in your own energy grid. Get your renewables out there. Begin to wean yourselves from the weapon that is being used against you, which is the dependency on fossil fuel and gas. So I know that, for instance, China, I know, is continuing right now to very rapidly deploy renewables. And China is the largest renewable manufacturer in the world, so they have an ability to be able to directly take a lot of that and put it to use. We need to be doing that all over the world. That was the remedy before Ukraine took place, and it's the remedy still even more so accentuated by what is happening in this starvation on fuel.
The thing is, as a result, even Germany is investing in gas facilities right now.
Yes, they are, but here's the way we at least look at it. There will be gas and oil pumped for some period of time, no matter what. That's cooked in to the rate at which people are now saying we will reduce our emissions. Net zero by 2050. To get to net zero by 2050, which is a pretty universal goal now, we need to reduce, according to the scientists, not me, not President Biden, but according to the scientists, as a matter of mathematics and physics, we must reduce emissions by at least 45%, preferably 50%, between now and 2030. So you can do that by using gas to some degree if it replaces coal or replaces oil. Why? Because gas is 50% less polluting. So for a period of time, if you're using gas in place of coal, that's a gain. That's a reduction in emissions. But after you reach 2030 or somewhere in that vicinity, in order to get to net zero by 2050, you must be reducing the emissions from the gas. And remember, it's only 50% less, not 100. So it's still emissions problems. And I think President Biden understands, and his policy embraces the notion, we can use gas to transition, but it must be transitional or capturing all of the emissions. And so replenishing some of what we needed to keep Europe and its economy humming, or to heat homes in very cold places and so forth, that will be necessary in the short term of the transition. But nobody should be fooled into thinking, oh, wow, you know, because of Ukraine, we can just forget about going ahead and dealing with the climate crisis. No, no, and no, you can't forget about that crisis. It has to be dealt with simultaneously, and the key will be reducing emissions as you go beyond 2030. But right now, we're not even on course to do what we said we'd do between now and 2030. So we have to really get together and start to kick into much higher gear. Much greater amounts reduced, much faster. That's the key.
There is a theory out there that the world's moving towards an era of climate competition, that countries are fighting for clean energy supply chains instead of working on a multilateral level. Is that accurate?
Well, there's a fair amount of competition, sure, but that's not, I mean, a competition, if it's not at the expense of the least developed and poorest people of the world, is not going to hurt people. I mean, clearly, people in Europe, people in Asia, people in the United States and other parts of the world would love to be the people discovering the fix, finding the battery storage that is good for weeks, or finding the quick trigger that's going to reduce the cost of producing green hydrogen. You know, people are going to make a lot of money, frankly, and they should in this. It's competitive. And there's about $1 trillion of venture capital now chasing these various solutions to the climate crisis. I think that's good. I'm not worried about that, as long as we're also prepared to provide those solutions to less developed countries, to folks who can't afford that technology. We talk always, President Biden is fixated on a just transition, on environmental justice. And that means that we do not leave people behind. This doesn't become something where the developed world has all the spoils, gets to fix and take care of itself at the expense of the rest of the world, particularly since it is the developed world that is creating the problem. 20 countries, the biggest 20 economies of the world, are responsible for 80% of all the emissions in the world. So as a matter of fundamental fairness, of morality, we have an obligation, and President Biden has accepted this by putting together a new program which he's funding with $12 billion over the next few years in order to help countries adapt and in order to build resilience in countries where they can't do it by themselves. But frankly, that's a pittance compared to what we really need on a global basis. So what we're working on doing now, a whole bunch of us, is bringing private capital to the table. Because the only place you will find the trillions of dollars you need to affect this transition and avoid the worst consequences of climate crisis, the only place you find it is in the private sector. No government in the world has enough money to do this by itself.
You talk about just transition, and the amount of money that's needed is about $30 trillion globally. The US, the UK, and the EU have pretty much committed to help the emerging markets. To date, they've not fulfilled the commitments.
Yeah, but they've gotten very, very close. There's close to 100 billion in the fund. It's not enough. Should it be the full 100? Yes, absolutely it should be. But there's a lot of other money being mobilized at the same time. We don't get credit for the money we mobilize. We've mobilized hundreds of billions of dollars. Right now, President Biden, through the legislation that he just passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, is mobilizing almost $500 billion together with the infrastructure bill to build out electric car capacity, to build out charging stations, to provide incentives for people to fix the power of their homes so it's less pollution. I mean, there are all kinds of things that are being excited, and they don't get credit for that. But I think the developed world is stepping up. And you see in Europe how Germany is now striving to get upwards of 80% of all its power produced from renewables. 75% of the new power in the United States of America, even while Donald Trump was president, who probably didn't know this was happening and certainly opposed it, but three quarters of the energy that came online in America in the last number of years is renewable. So people are doing things. There's a lot happening. I'm convinced the world is going to get to a net zero carbon economy. We will get there. The challenge is, will we get there in time to avoid the worst consequences of the crisis? And right now, as you and I sit here, that's not happening. That's our challenge. And over the next weeks, as we go to Sharm el-Sheikh, as we come together in New York, we must agree to accelerate the provision of funding, the sharing of technology, the targets that we're setting in our countries have to grow. We've got to treat this like a war. I mean, literally mobilizing every facet of our economy to deal with it. And I'm not an alarmist. I'm not a Cassandra on this. I believe we can deal with it. We can win the battle, but only if we make the choices we need to make now and build our response.
Everybody needs to be on board, including emerging markets, emerging countries. Is it a hard sell to countries like Vietnam, which are pretty reluctant to take on additional debt?
Yeah. Well, we're not asking them to take on, they don't have to take on big additional debt, and certainly at any high price. But the reality is Vietnam is a country, even though it's small in terms of its current level of contribution, it's contributing a lot through its coal. Vietnam needs to move away from coal burning that is unabated, coal that is just burning, and you don't have the emissions capture that you need. That's what's unacceptable. And we need to help them. That's why I'm here, because we think we do have ways to be able to assist Vietnam to make this transition, just as we have committed to help Indonesia to provide finance and provide the technology to make the transition. Now, some of it will be concessionary money, some of it will be philanthropy, donating, and some of it will be financed through the multilateral development banks, and some of it, a good part of it, is going to be then the blended finance that comes in through the private sector that is willing to invest. And it's absolutely legitimate to ask people and to allow people to invest in providing a service that produces revenue. If you're providing power to people, people pay for the power. the revenue stream that pays for the power can support the debt. Not Vietnam supporting it, but the revenue that comes in. And people get a better service. They get more power. They get cheaper power. They get power that comes from the right source, which is renewable. So I think there's a virtuous economy waiting for us as we move to more circular economy where we're thinking about sustainable development goals, about sustainability itself, and we are making wiser decisions about how we use resources and what we do. Finally, just to accent what I said about the inappropriate division of the problem here, the 20 countries that equal 80% of all emissions bear the greatest responsibility to be reducing those emissions because it is harming other countries. But other countries need to also step up and not repeat the mistakes that everybody else made. If there's a premium that you have to pay a little bit to be green, it's worth paying it, because if you don't, you're going to pay it down the road through the damages, through the floods, through the extreme heat, through all the other problems that will follow. And common sense says we're all in this together. Particularly if you look at Africa, for instance, where 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa equal 0.55% of all emissions. I mean, you look at that imbalance, 20 countries, 80%, 48 countries, 0.55%, you can understand why some people are getting pretty angry.
I want to touch on the Arctic very quickly. China views it as a new strategic frontier, and it is cooperating with Russia for developments there. We know there's oil, there's gas, there's rare earths. How does the U.S. plan to respond to that?
Well, we have an Arctic Commission. We have a process regarding the Arctic. Russia is at the table. The U.S., Denmark, Norway, countries that are, abutting the Arctic, have a very serious process what they've been engaged in. I chaired that commission when I was Secretary of State for 2 years, and we did set-asides of areas, and we dealt with black carbon, and we agreed on certain rules about how you approach claims and other kinds of things. The key is those countries who are on that commission need to be fair stewards for the rest of the world. And there needs to be a careful legal process by which it is managed. It cannot become a grab bag. And countries that don't border can't start creating military tensions or other kinds of tensions by not adhering to what we've lived with for many years when it was ice and snow, and it worked pretty well as a way of managing that particular landmass.
Senator Kerry, just one final question. I mean, lots of rumblings on the ground that COP27 is your last. Might you consider extending your term, your position, given the gravitas you bring to the position?
I have not heard any of these rumblings. I'm moving too fast to hear rumblings. So I'm going to just keep working, and hopefully we can make Sharm el-Sheikh do everything it needs to do. That's the key.